The flashlight hit her eyes before the officer said a single word. Colonel Teresa Johnson kept both hands on the wheel, 10 and 2, the way she'd taught 100 junior soldiers to do it during a routine stop, and waited for Officer Jason Harrison to ask for her license instead of aiming the beam like a weapon. He didn't ask. He stood at her window a full 10 seconds just looking, like her ordinary grey sedan owed him an explanation before he'd even opened his mouth.
License and registration.
No greeting. No reason given. Of course, Teresa said, reaching slowly for the glove box, narrating the movement the way she would for a checkpoint overseas. May I ask why I'm being stopped? Rolled through the stop sign back there. Harrison's jaw was tight, his flashlight still trained on her face rather than her hands. Didn't come to a full stop. She hadn't. Not by much. A soft roll at an empty four-way. 11 at night. Not a car or pedestrian in sight for 2 blocks. It wasn't worth arguing. She handed over her license, calm, unhurried, and he took it without looking at it, his eyes still on her. Whose car is this? Mine. You sure about that? The question landed strange, like it wasn't really about the car at all. Teresa felt the small, familiar tightening in her chest, the one she'd learned to keep off her face a long time ago. I'm sure. Harrison didn't move to run the plate. He didn't move toward his cruiser. Instead, he leaned down another inch, studying her the way a man studies something he's already decided is suspicious, and said, "Step out of the vehicle. I want to take a look inside." "On what grounds?" Teresa asked, still even, still polite. "I rolled a stop sign." "That's what you said. On the grounds that I asked you to." His hand dropped to the door handle before she'd agreed to anything. "We can do this the easy way." She stepped out because arguing on the shoulder of an empty road at 11 at night wasn't a fight worth having, not yet, and stood with her hands visible while he searched her car the way you search a car you've already decided is hiding something. He went through the glove box first, insurance card, owner's manual, and beneath it, an ID card he clearly wasn't expecting. He turned it over in his hand. U.S. Army, Colonel Teresa D. Johnson. "This yours?" He looked at her, civilian clothes, tired eyes, an ordinary Tuesday, and something in his face didn't soften. If anything, it hardened, like the card was one more thing to be suspicious of, rather than one more thing to consider. "This real?" "It's real. You don't look like you're on your way anywhere official." "I'm off duty," Teresa said. "I'm driving home." Harrison held the card a moment longer than he needed to, turning it in the flashlight beam like he expected it to reveal something fake in a certain light, then slid it into his own pocket instead of handing it back. "I'm going to hold on to this while we sort this out." That was the first line Teresa would remember weeks later and turn over in her mind more than any other, not because it was cruel, but because of how ordinary it sounded to him, how certain, like a man simply doing his job, instead of a man taking something that wasn't his to take. Across the street, unnoticed by either of them, the security camera bolted above the pumps of a closed gas station kept doing exactly what it had done every night for 6 years, recording everything, in silence, for no one in particular. Neither of them knew it was there. Harrison wrote the citation standing at his own cruiser, back to her, in no hurry now that he had what he wanted. When he finally returned her license, and, almost as an afterthought, the ID card dropped back into her hand rather than given, he said, "Drive safe," in the flat tone of a man who believed the matter was already closed. Teresa didn't argue the ticket. She didn't raise her voice, didn't recite her rank, didn't ask him if he understood what he'd just done. She only said, "I'd like your badge number," and wrote it. Down when he gave it, her handwriting steady, in a way her hands had no business being after that. She drove the rest of the way home in silence, replaying the 10 seconds his hand had spent on the door handle before she'd agreed to anything, and the longer stretch of seconds her ID had spent in his pocket instead of hers. She didn't know yet about the camera across the street. She didn't know that somewhere in Ridgefield, a decision was already being made that Officer Jason Harrison would come to regret, not because anyone was hunting for a reason to end his career, but because he'd left one sitting in plain sight, watching the entire time. Comment below, do you think Colonel Johnson should have said something right there on the roadside, or was staying silent the smarter move? Subscribe to find out what happens when that footage surfaces. The gate guard at Fort Calloway didn't recognize her. Colonel Teresa Johnson had driven through that checkpoint more mornings than she could count, and every one of those mornings had started the same way: badge out the window, a nod, a wave through. This morning she sat with her hand resting on an empty spot in her wallet where the ID should have been, explaining to a 23-year-old specialist why a colonel was asking him to call the provost marshal's office to confirm her identity. "It'll just take a minute, ma'am," he said, clearly more nervous than she was. It took 11. Long enough for a line to form behind her, long enough for her to sit there and think about the ease with which Officer Jason Harrison had slipped that card into his pocket the night before, like it was something he was owed rather than something that belonged to her. By the time she reached her office, she'd already decided the ID wasn't the point. The point was how casually he'd taken it, the same ease with which he'd decided, before she'd said more than a few words, exactly what kind of person she was. Her aide, Master Sergeant Priya Deshmukh, knocked once and stepped in without waiting for an answer, the way she'd earned the right to, after 4 years working alongside her. "You're okay." "I'm fine." Teresa set her coffee down without drinking it. "I need you to pull the number for Delaney Cross. And get me the provost's office again. I want to know what it takes to report a civilian law enforcement agency for holding on to a service member's ID without cause." Deshmukh didn't ask why. She wrote both down. That's 2 different offices for 1 traffic stop. It wasn't a traffic stop by the time he'd finished with it. Teresa finally looked up. It was a search. "I want it documented as one." That was the version of anger Teresa allowed herself. Not raised voices, not a fist on the desk, just 2 phone numbers written on a legal pad and a decision that would, by the end of the week, put Ridgefield PD in contact with people who didn't answer to a union rep. Across town, Harrison hadn't given the stop a second thought. He filed his report the way he always did, competently, efficiently, and with just enough missing that no one reading it would ask the wrong question. Vehicle rolled stop sign. Driver produced ID, unable to immediately verify authenticity. ID retained pending confirmation, returned to driver at conclusion of stop. No mention of the search. No mention that he'd never actually attempted to verify anything before deciding to keep the card in his own pocket for the better part of 15 minutes. Officer Renee Castillo read it over his shoulder in the break room, not because she was suspicious, but because she was bored and he'd left it open on the shared terminal. "You searched her car for a rolled stop sign?" "I searched her car because something felt off." Harrison didn't look up from his sandwich. "Woman driving alone at night gets cagey when I ask a simple question. That's not nothing, Castillo." "Did she get cagey, or did she ask why you were searching her car?" He set the sandwich down. "Same thing, depending who you ask." Castillo didn't push it further, but she didn't laugh either, and the absence of his usual audience needled him more than any actual pushback would have. He wanted someone to agree with him. Instead, he got a co-worker who read the report twice before walking away, and a silence that sat in the room a beat longer than he liked. He told himself it didn't matter. He'd been doing this 9 years. He knew what off looked like. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing yet, was that a security camera bolted to the awning of a gas station he'd never once glanced at had a clean, unobstructed view of his own cruiser, his own hand on her door, and the 11 minutes his report had quietly shortened to 4. Teresa's attorney called 2 days later. "I want to be straightforward with you," Delaney Cross said. "This is winnable. The seizure of a federal ID without cause is going to matter more to a judge than the stop sign ever will. But I need you to understand something. Before we file anything, the moment we do, this stops being quiet. Department, union, maybe press eventually. Are you prepared for that?" Teresa didn't hesitate. "I was prepared for that the night he put my ID in his pocket instead of his hand." "That's not a yes." "It's a yes," Teresa said. "I just want you to understand why." She didn't need to explain it twice. Cross had handled enough of these to recognize the difference between a client chasing a payout and a client who'd simply run out of patience for being underestimated, and Teresa Johnson, calm, deliberate, unwilling to raise her voice even now, was unmistakably the second kind. The complaint went in that afternoon. Formal, procedural, addressed to Ridgefield PD's Internal Affairs Division and copied, deliberately, to the installation's provost marshal. A detailed cross included specifically because it meant 2 institutions, with no reason to protect Officer Harrison, would now be looking at the same file. The complaint landed on Captain Owen Reyes' desk the following morning. The same hour Harrison stood in the break room, finishing a story he'd told twice already that week. She wanted to make it a whole thing. He was saying, not for the first time, to whoever would listen. Flashed the ID like it was supposed to change something. I've had that happen before. Nothing ever sticks. He didn't see Reyes standing in the doorway behind him, a thin folder in one hand, reading the first line of a complaint that mentioned an ID card Harrison had described in his own report as returned to driver at conclusion of stop. A detail that, according to the woman who filed it, wasn't true. Harrison. Reyes's voice was flat enough to end the story mid-sentence. My office. For the first time since the stop, something in Harrison's chest tightened without his permission. Captain Reyes didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He set the folder on the desk between them and turned it so Harrison could read the top line himself. Unlawful seizure of a federal identification card. Unauthorized search of a private vehicle without probable cause. Excessive detention. He let each phrase sit before adding the last one. Filed by a colonel, Harrison, not a civilian who might get talked out of it. A colonel with an attorney who copied the installation's provost marshal on every page. I searched the car because something felt off. Harrison heard how thin it sounded even as he said it. Your report says you returned the ID at the conclusion of the stop. Reyes tapped the folder. Her complaint says you kept it for the better part of 15 minutes and only handed it back after you'd already written the citation. Those can't both be true. Harrison didn't answer that. He didn't have an answer that survived being said out loud. I'm not asking you to confess to anything, Reyes said, quieter now, which somehow felt worse than if he'd shouted. I'm telling you Internal Affairs is opening a file, and I've already requested the area canvass. Every business with a camera on that stretch of road between 10 and midnight. That's standard procedure. I'd have done it for any complaint like this one. He paused. I want you to understand that before it happens, not after. The gas station's owner didn't ask many questions when two officers showed up requesting 6 hours of footage from a camera he'd forgotten still worked half the time. He handed over the drive without much interest, more concerned about a walk-in cooler that had been running warm since Tuesday than about whatever his parking lot camera happened to catch on some Tuesday night 3 weeks back. Detective Marisol Ferreira watched it first, alone, in a room with the blinds half drawn, and stopped the footage twice before she reached the end. The angle was wide and slightly grainy, but wide enough. It showed Harrison's cruiser pulling in behind the sedan. It showed him approaching the window without hesitation, his hand already resting near his holster before the driver had said a word. It showed the door opening, not offered, taken. And it showed, unmistakably, a card changing hands and disappearing into his jacket pocket, while the woman stood with her arms at her sides, patient in a way the footage made look almost unbearable to watch. 11 minutes and 40 seconds between the moment he took the card and the moment he gave it back. Ferreira didn't need audio to know what those 11 minutes were. She'd worked enough of these to recognize the shape of it, a man deciding in real time that he was allowed to hold on to something that wasn't his, because no one in that moment was positioned to stop him. She called Reyes into the room and ran it again. There's no ambiguity here, she said when it ended. This isn't a stop that got a little rough. This is a search with nothing behind it, and a seizure he lied about in his own paperwork. Reyes watched the timestamp count down in the corner and said, mostly to himself, this isn't staying internal. Teresa learned about the footage the same way she'd learned about the complaint's progress so far, through a short professional call from Delaney Cross, who had a habit of leading with the facts before the feelings. That's not the same thing. Cross didn't argue. She'd read enough officer statements to know Teresa was probably right. Harrison found out 3 days later, not from Reyes but from a subpoena. It arrived at the precinct addressed to him personally, language he had to read twice to fully absorb, a civil rights complaint, filed in federal court naming him individually in the Ridgeville Police Department as co-defendants. Unlawful search and seizure, unlawful detention, violation of Title 42 protections he'd heard of only in passing, in a training module he'd clicked through years ago without finishing. He read the plaintiff's name at the bottom twice, like it might change the second time, Colonel Teresa D. Johnson. Somewhere between the first read and the second, the version of the story he'd been telling himself, a routine stop, a driver who got cagey, a card he'd simply held onto for procedure's sake, started to feel less like an explanation and more like something he was going to have to defend under oath, in front of people who wouldn't take his word for it, the way Castillo had almost been willing to. He carried the papers into Reyes's office without being called in this time. They're taking this to trial. I told you this wasn't staying internal. Reyes didn't look particularly surprised. There's more, Jason. He turned his monitor around. You should see this before your attorney does. The footage started playing. Harrison watched himself from an angle he'd never known existed, walking toward a car with his hand already near his weapon before anyone inside it had done anything at all. He watched his own hand close around a card that wasn't his and disappear into his pocket. He watched 11 minutes tick by on a timestamp he couldn't argue with, couldn't edit, couldn't shorten in a report the way he had the first time. For the first time since that night on Reynolds Road, Jason Harrison understood that the version of events he'd controlled had never actually existed at all. There's a pre-trial hearing in 3 weeks, Reyes said, switching off the monitor. I'd start preparing like it's real, because it is. The courtroom filled slower than Harrison expected, which somehow made it worse. He'd pictured a handful of people, a clerk, a bailiff, the usual quiet churn of a Tuesday docket. Instead, the gallery kept filling past 9, uniforms scattered among the civilian suits, some from his own precinct, most from somewhere he didn't recognize, Fort Calloway insignia on more than a few shoulders. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody needed to. The room had already decided something before the first witness was called, and he could feel it in the way conversations dropped half a register whenever he glanced up. His attorney, Charles Ferris, leaned close. Don't react to the room. React to the evidence. That's what wins this. Harrison nodded, but his eyes kept drifting to the far side of the aisle, where Colonel Teresa Johnson sat in her service uniform, spine straight, hands folded, a chest of ribbons catching the fluorescent light every time she shifted. She wasn't looking at him. She didn't need to. The people, the plaintiff, calls Colonel Teresa Johnson. She walked to the stand the way Harrison imagined she walked into rooms most days, unhurried, unbothered, like the outcome had already been decided somewhere he wasn't invited. The judge, an older woman named Cynthia Marsh, glanced at the uniform, the ribbons, and said only, "Thank you for your service, Colonel. You may proceed when ready," before nodding to Delaney Cross. Colonel Johnson, walk us through the night of the stop. Teresa did, plainly without embellishment, the stop sign, the flashlight in her eyes before a single question was asked, the demand to step out of the vehicle before any grounds were given. She didn't raise her voice once. She didn't need to. The plainness of it did more damage than outrage could have. Did you resist at any point? No. Did you refuse any lawful order? No. Did Officer Harrison explain why he was searching your vehicle before he began? No. He said it was because something felt off. And your identification, what happened to it? He took it from the glove box, looked at it, and put it in his own pocket. I asked for it back. He told me he'd be holding on to it while he sorted things out. A short pause, not for effect, simply a fact that needed a beat to land. It stayed in his pocket for 11 minutes. Cross let that number sit in the room before continuing. Colonel, why did you file this complaint? You could have let the citation go. Most people do. Because he didn't ask who I was before deciding what I was, Teresa said. And the next person he does that to might not have a second camera watching, or an attorney, or a rank that made anyone take the complaint seriously. I didn't file this for me. I filed it so his report would have to match what actually happened. The gallery stayed silent, the particular silence of people choosing not to react visibly while clearly reacting internally. Then came the footage. Cross played it without commentary, letting the gas station's camera speak for itself. The approach, the hand near the holster before a word was exchanged, the door taken rather than offered, the card disappearing into a jacket pocket, while Teresa stood with her hands visible and still. The 11-minute timestamp scrolled in the corner, indifferent and exact, the way no report ever managed to be. When it ended, Judge Marsh didn't speak for a moment. She simply looked at Harrison across the courtroom, the way people look at something they've already made up their mind about, but are still willing to hear defended. Ferris tried. Your Honor, my client has a 9-year record without a single sustained complaint prior to this. That's not what's on trial today, Mr. Ferris, Marsh said. What's on trial is 11 minutes and a report that doesn't match a video recording. I'd like to hear from your client directly. Harrison took the stand with his jaw set, the same posture he used to lean on for authority, now doing nothing but making him look like a man bracing for impact. Officer Harrison, the prosecutor began, why did you search Colonel Johnson's vehicle? I had a feeling something wasn't right. A feeling. Not a smell of alcohol, not an object in plain view, not an admission of any kind. Correct. Why did you keep her identification instead of returning it once you'd read it? Harrison hesitated. There wasn't a version of the answer that survived the footage sitting fresh in everyone's memory. I wanted to confirm it was authentic. Did you attempt to confirm that at any point during those 11 minutes? A call to dispatch, a database check, anything? Silence stretched a full 3 seconds before he answered. No. So, for 11 minutes, you held a federal officer's identification in your pocket, for no operational reason at all. Harrison's mouth tightened. I didn't know who she was. Would it have mattered? The prosecutor asked. Quiet now. If you had. The question hung there long enough that even Harrison seemed to hear how it should be answered, and how far that answer was from anything he could actually say out loud in front of a room full of the people she led. I don't know, he finally said. Maybe. I'd like to think I'd have handled it the same either way. Nobody in the gallery believed him. He could feel that they didn't. Closing arguments ran short. Cross needed only a handful of sentences to remind the room what mattered. Not who Colonel Johnson was, but what had been done to her regardless of who she was, and what that revealed about how easily authority could be mistaken for permission. Judge Marsh gathered her notes, looked once more at both tables and said, I'll take a brief recess before delivering my findings. Harrison sat rigid beside Ferris, who offered nothing reassuring this time. Across the aisle, Teresa sat exactly as she had all morning, still upright, giving nothing away. 12 minutes later, the side door opened, and Judge Marsh walked back in with a single sheet of paper in her hand. The room went quiet before she'd said a word. Judge Marsh didn't sit before she spoke. She stood at the bench with the single sheet of paper in her hand, and the room held still, the way rooms do when everyone already suspects the answer and is only waiting to hear it confirmed. In the matter of Johnson versus Harrison and the Ridgefield Police Department, she began, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff. No one in the gallery made a sound. Teresa didn't move, didn't exhale visibly, didn't do anything but keep her hands folded the way they'd been folded since the moment she sat down that morning. The court finds that Officer Harrison's search of the plaintiff's vehicle lacked probable cause, that his retention of her federal identification for 11 minutes constituted unlawful seizure, and that his written report materially misrepresented the sequence of events. Marsh set the paper down. The plaintiff is awarded damages, and this ruling will be forwarded to the Ridgefield Police Department's disciplinary board for review, along with a recommendation that department policy on identification handling and search justification be formally revised. Harrison sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him, staring at a spot just past the judge's shoulder, the posture of a man who understood, finally and completely, that there was no version of this he could still control. The disciplinary board moved faster than most people expected. Within 2 weeks, Harrison was placed on unpaid suspension pending termination review, not for the stop itself, the board's letter made clear, but for the falsified report, the single decision that had turned an already indefensible search into something no union representative could talk down. Officer Castillo was the one who told him, in the parking lot, because nobody else wanted to be the one to say it out loud. She didn't say she told him so. She didn't need to. She just said, you should have let Reyes see the footage before you wrote anything down, and walked back inside, leaving him standing beside a cruiser he wasn't sure he'd be driving again. Captain Reyes, for his part, didn't gloat either. When asked by a local reporter whether the department had failed to catch the pattern earlier, he said only, we're implementing new review procedures for any stop involving a search or seized property. That should have already been standard. It is now. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was the department admitting, in its own careful language, that something had needed to change and hadn't until it was forced to. Teresa didn't attend the disciplinary hearing. She'd already gotten what she came for, not Harrison's job, though that was its own consequence, but a public record that couldn't be quietly filed away the way 2 earlier complaints against him apparently had been. "You could have asked for more," Delaney Cross told her afterward, packing up the last of the case files. "Punitive damages, a public statement from the department, more than what you got." "I didn't want more," Teresa said. "I wanted it documented. I wanted the next person this happens to have a case file to point to instead of starting from nothing." She paused, considering the folder in Cross's hands, like it had already become something smaller than it once was. "That's enough." 2 months later, Teresa stood in front of a room of new recruits at Fort Calloway, there to talk about leadership, not about herself, though she knew by now that the story had traveled ahead of her into every room she walked into. "How many of you think rank earns you automatic respect?" she asked. A few hands went up, uncertain. "I used to think the uniform did some of that work for me," she said. "Then I found out it doesn't, not really. What earns respect is what you do when someone assumes the worst about you, and you have every opportunity to prove them right back." She let that sit for a moment before continuing. "I didn't win anything by raising my voice that night. I won it by writing down a badge number, keeping my hands where they could be seen, and trusting that the truth, given enough time, doesn't need help." In the back row, one of the newer recruits, a young black woman who'd requested this specific training block after hearing about the case secondhand, sat forward slightly, the way people do when something said aloud finally matches something they'd only felt privately before. Teresa noticed. She always did. It was, she'd come to understand, the actual point of standing up there at all. "Authority without accountability isn't strength," she said, closing her notes without needing to look down at them. "It's just a mask for something that eventually comes apart on its own. All I did was refuse to look away while it did." She stepped down without ceremony, no applause expected or wanted, and the recruits filed out already, talking quietly among themselves. Not about her rank this time, but about what they'd do the next time someone assumed the worst about them before knowing a single true thing. Somewhere across town, a patrol car sat unused in an impound lot, waiting on a decision that had already, in every way that mattered, been made. If you've ever been judged before anyone bothered to learn who you really were, you already know exactly what this story was about. If this story moved you, hit like, drop a comment telling us what stood out most, and subscribe for more stories where the truth finally gets its say.